Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This week's video is inspired by the questions, comments, and messages I received in my Artemis review video. If you're not familiar with that video, I will leave it linked in the cards above for you to check out. But for those of you who are watching this video first, the general opinion was that Artemis from DaVinci is a direct copy of Moonglow from Daniel Smith. If you are familiar with me, my work, or my channel, then you may already know that I'm not someone who works with Daniel Smith very often. I'm also not someone who works with granulating or really many multi-pigment colors. So I was completely unaware that Moonglow or any other similar color to Artemis even existed. I only recently became aware of DaVinci watercolors, and I very quickly became hooked, making a few videos featuring their paints already. I had just recently started exploring more boutique or interesting colors when I received a newsletter from DaVinci showing off their brand new color, Artemis. I was so enchanted by the artwork that they used to display this beautiful new color that I just had to try it. I decided to make a review video shortly after to help others know if this would be a good fit for them in their painting style or collection. To my surprise, I was met with quite a few comments, messages, and questions all about how it was exactly like Moonglow. I'm sure you can imagine my initial surprise to find out that I had spent all of this time carefully crafting a review of a color that had a long-standing identical twin. I felt quite silly and frankly really bad that I had reviewed a dupe, fully believing that I should have purchased the original, which is of course difficult considering I didn't even know it existed at the time of purchase. In all of the comments, I received one that made me feel much better. It was none other than the woman who painted the beautiful paintings that made me want to try Artemis in the first place, Tanya from Scratch Made Journal. She explained that the colors were actually quite different and that I shouldn't feel bad for making a video that was simply made to help consumers and paint enthusiasts alike decide if a paint color is for them. I felt a little better after reading her unbelievably kind comments and just thought that that was the end of it. However, to my surprise, she later emailed me asking if I would like to try a sample of Moonglow from her own collection for me to compare for myself. I took her up on her unbelievably kind gesture, and now I'm here to compare the two. So, to get started, if you're not familiar with either or both of these brands or colors, I will go over a few reasons why so many people felt that they were identical. If you were to just look at the pigment information, they both use the same pigments, PG18, PB29, and PR177, both listed in the same order. They're both granulating, are transparent or semi-transparent. They both have a light fastness rating of 1 or excellent, and they are both staining. Each color makes its presence known in a painting with their moody, unique, and atmospheric qualities. The deep moody purples, the blue granulation, and the warm undertones can make these colors on their own seem identical. I am, however, quite excited to tell you that they are actually very different from one another, and I think you will find throughout the course of this comparison video that having one is not equal to having the other. For this video, I'm going to repeat the same test that I did with Artemis, and along the way I'm going to talk about my findings with Moonglow and how it compares to Artemis. I will also be adding my scans of the two tests side by side for you to compare for yourself. In the dilution test, I wanted to see the full range of this color, from its most diluted value all the way up to its Masstone. I started with the most diluted value and I slowly added more paint to see the full range of color variation and characteristics. I immediately noticed that Moonglow was warmer than Artemis in its lightest dilution. But just like Artemis, it has no granulation present. It has an atmospheric airiness to it that leaves the final color a bit of a mystery and open to interpretation. The second swatch is still quite warm compared to Artemis, but even on its own, it's still very identifiable as a warm color. It's very apparent that it's a multi-pigment paint with some visible variation, but it makes no mistake that the red pigment is going to be much more visible in the final color. There's definitely a bit of atmosphere starting to peek through, just like with Artemis at this stage. However, the granulation is already becoming more apparent with Moonglow. The granulation is still very minimal and subtle. Barely being seen up close, it's really more captivating than it is textural. Daniel Smith is known for their granulating properties, so it's no surprise that the textural properties would start to become visible earlier on than DaVinci. The third swatch is probably the most interesting so far. The overall color and texture are competing visually, so it can look a bit more red or blue at any moment. The overall color leans towards a warm, slightly desaturated purple, but with the light blue granulation showing through almost everywhere and pockets of red in between. Compared to Artemis, there is more granulation, and while there is warmer areas in Artemis, they really are adding to a purple ambiance rather than showing up as a red color like in Moonglow. The next couple swatches are pretty similar, with the color starting to become more clear. The red and blue pigments still seem to be competing for visual space, and the granulation is becoming quite apparent, but the pockets of blue are more isolated. The warmth from the red is still present, but is slowly becoming less visible as it becomes absorbed into the overall purple color. When comparing the two colors, the granulation in Artemis is actually heavier, more pronounced, and more ribboned throughout the swatch versus the smaller pockets of granulation in Moonglow. Also, Artemis has a darker granulation, adding to the moody, atmospheric, textural Payne's gray nighttime vibe. I was actually quite surprised to see that Artemis was much more textural at this point. The overall color of Moonglow is still warmer than Artemis, but as Moonglow changes to purple, Artemis is changing to a cool gray. As we work our way through the middle dilution swatches, we continue to see the overall color change and darken. The base color is becoming more of a purple gray while still staying on the warm side. The light blue granulation is still present, but it's becoming harder to see as the color gets darker. The color continues to darken, the light blue granulation starts to become hidden, and the granulation becomes darker, nearing black. The last swatches where the blue granulation is still present, you can see them clustered with areas of red and darkening granulation spots. At the same time, Artemis has really started to lose most of its variation, transitioning to mostly a cool gray with dark granulation spots. Artemis also noticeably has more granulation at this point. In some areas there are pockets of warmth showing through as the dark granulation breaks. Even though there are areas of warmer color, keep in mind that it's really more of a neutral gray and not the purple color we see in Moonglow. As we start to get into the more concentrated swatches, we can see the warm purple start to mute a bit. The warm purple is taking on more of a consistent color, but the increased depth has intensified the look of the desaturation, leaning further towards a purple-gray color. The granulation is now almost completely dark and is getting more pronounced. There are still some small areas of blue granulation and some smaller breaks in the darker granulation peeking through to warmer areas, but overall the color is becoming much more consistent and dark. Artemis also has a very consistent color and dark granulation now too, but at this point I would say the granulation in Artemis continues to be more pronounced. In the last couple swatches, I noticed that Moonglow and Artemis share a lot of similar characteristics. The color was almost completely evened out, the granulation was quite dark and pronounced, taking over most of the swatch, and the color seemed to be a consistent moody grayish tone. This is where I can see the colors being mistaken as identical, especially if you don't have one to compare to the other. However, in real life, I can assure you that the overall color is still quite different from one another. Artemis is very cool, like a granulating Payne's gray. It has very little to no granulation in the color, other to be cool and dark. The color density has taken over in the granulated areas, leaving no signs of warmth or the light blue granulation. Comparing this to Moonglow, some of this is true, but with one big distinction. Moonglow is still much warmer. If I were to try to describe the overall color of Moonglow, I would liken it to a very desaturated purple. The granulation has lost all of its diversity, mainly appearing black now, and the concentrated color has visually limited the color seen to a dark, warm, grayish purple. I mentioned earlier that Daniel Smith was known for their granulation, so I speculated early on that the granulation in Moonglow would be much stronger than Artemis. However, in this particular test, that became untrue very quickly, with Artemis showing much more granulation and texture through most of the test. Next is the glazing test. This is not only to see how the paint can glaze, but also how the color can build and change from layer to layer. From my brief experience with Daniel Smith, I have seen that they glaze very well. Again, keep in mind that these are non-granulating and mostly single pigment colors that I have worked with. Also, if you have watched my Artemis video or any other DaVinci videos, then you will know that their watercolors glaze very well and Artemis was no exception. Just like in the Artemis review, I worked up a medium dilution of this paint and applied it across the entire section that I have broken up into 3/4 inch sections. I tried to keep the dilution the same throughout the entire process, but do keep in mind that I let these glazes air dry completely, so the paint had to be reactivated and remixed each time. I found Moonglow at the beginning to glaze very well, but not quite as well as Artemis. I can see the hard water lines from the glazes in the beginning, but they very quickly begin to soften. The color is really quite beautiful and interesting as the glazes build, and the color starts to deepen immediately. As the glazes build up, the color remains a really deep purple, but still slightly desaturated, but it keeps its vibrancy much more than in the concentrated dilution test swatches. I also noticed that the granulation becomes more and more even throughout the glazing process. I noticed that the blue granulation of Moonglow stays fairly isolated in a single glaze, staying together in little pockets of color. As they glaze, the entire section has this beautiful color variety. As the granulation becomes more even, the red color is peeking through, and there are small areas of darker texture. Just like with Artemis, after a few glazes, I could really start to see the color deepen and the granulation become quite dark as it fills the paper's texture. In many ways, Moonglow and Artemis are similar in glazing. The color builds in a way that is different from the dilution test. The blue granulation is visible in much darker areas, the granulation becomes more even, and the warm undertones are much more present, almost becoming exaggerated in the areas where the granulation is not present. Also, just like with Artemis, the glazing started getting really sloppy after several layers. However, I would give a slight edge to Artemis. The mass tone of each color is near black, both in the glazing test and in the dilution test. Each one has their own undertone showing through, with Moonglow being warm and Artemis being cool. The final few glazes in the glazing test had almost all of the paper's texture filled with near black granulation, with even colors showing through the swatches, and the binder is becoming shiny on the paper. In the binder build-up comparison, Moonglow had significantly less binder build-up compared to Artemis. However, if you are familiar with DaVinci, this may not come as a surprise to many. While I don't have many issues with binder buildup with this brand, many people do, and glazing just exacerbates the problem. In the dilution test, the mass tone color is uneven in both brands, with a consistent undertone and near black granulation. Again, the base colors strongly reflect each color's unique undertone. Next, I wanted to test the flow of this paint. I wet the entire area of making sure that the paper was saturated and glistening but not puddling. Then I worked up a concentrated mix of my paint in my brush and touched the center of my wet paper. My first impression was that this paint was quite active. It seemed to flow quickly from the brush. However, after a few minutes, it became clear that the paint stayed pretty central on the wet swatch, and only traces of color filled the entire section. So while the majority of the pigment stayed near where I placed my brush, I did notice a faint pigment line around the edge of the box. Subsequent tests showed the exact same results, some with a bit more flow and puddled paper. The faint pigmentation around the center area is actually really stunning, with pastel areas of pink and blue swirling throughout the swatch. This result is slightly different from the Artemis swatch. While Artemis did stay quite central in the application area, it also feathered out, leaving two distinct circular areas of pigmentation before it stopped entirely, leaving only the wet paper behind. In a weird way, you could argue that each of these colors is both more and less active in wet and wet than the other, depending on your own opinion and desired look. For the lifting test, I wanted to see how the color lifts when wet and when dried. For this test, which I did accurately on another sheet of paper, I painted the entire area with a pretty concentrated amount of paint, and then I blotted the wet paint up with a paper towel. You'll notice in the clip that I'm showing that I used a clean towel blotted brush to lift the wet paint, and that worked really well, reducing the staining, but the remaining moisture from the brush on the paper did allow for the red staining color to flow through into my blotted area. On the paper blotted test, I noticed that Moonglow was equally staining to Artemis, each with their individual undertone showing through. However, I will say that Moonglow lifted cleaner and easier than Artemis. I also noticed on the wet lifting test that Artemis had much more noticeable granulation left behind, and Moonglow lifted more thoroughly. Lastly, Artemis left behind areas of a cloudy or opaque look to it, and Moonglow lifted cleanly wherever the paper towel touched. On the dry lifting test, I allowed the paper to dry fully, and then I took a clean, wet brush and wet the area. I did a couple gentle back and forth motions across the swatch and waited until I saw the pigment moving in this wet area. Then I dried my brush and dried it slowly across the wet area to pick up the water and pigment on the paper. I dried my brush with each pass. I noticed that Moonglow was very staining, leaving behind a pink area with each test on different paper types. Finally, I'm testing how well this color blends out as I add water. I use this technique a lot to soften the edges or to create gradients in my washes, so it's important that my paints can do this well. I started by adding a concentrated mix of color, carrying it down the first third of my swatch area. Then I rinsed off my brush and I blot off excess water to avoid adding too much water to my paper and adding an undesired effect. Then I blend out the paint with a back and forth motion, carefully pulling the pigment as I go. I repeat these steps again so that the final section of my swatch area should be clear. I found both of these to be active in their own ways, creating different results with this test. If you remember, Artemis was very active in wet and wet flow, but still had a dense area in the middle. I have found that DaVinci watercolors need a little bit more working to get a smooth gradient than some other brands. Moonglow was definitely quite active in the blending experience, but like Artemis and in the previous tests, it's not as flowy as some other colors. So while there was some active pigment in this process, trying to fill the entire wet area with small traces of pigment, it's still a very heavy paint, staying very close to the applied area. One big difference is that Moonglow flowed more gracefully during this test, allowing it to flow out rather than cauliflower like Artemis. However, there is still a pigment shelf where the color abruptly stops without further manipulation. So, as you can see throughout these tests, these are actually very different colors, despite being nearly identical on the surface. I noticed that Moonglow does seem to be more pigmented than Artemis. However, both colors need a lot of paint to complete these tests, more than I'm used to with other types of colors that I've used. Moonglow is much warmer than Artemis through all of the various tests, with the red pigment really being an independent, standout characteristic of this paint that makes its presence known in its staining capabilities. With Artemis, the role of the red pigment is substantially diminished, mostly adding an ambiance to the final color rather than having visible red pigment. Both have light blue granulation showing through, but Artemis is much more pronounced in the early glazes. Moonglow does allow the blue granulation to show through a bit more in darker concentrations though. The way the granulation is presented is different in each color. With Moonglow, the granulation is much more isolated, showing up in clusters. Artemis has much more even granulation dispersion, almost in ribbons throughout the swatch. Each color presents very dark, near black granulation when painted or glazed in a dark color, and both tend to fill the tooth of the paper. Finally, each color has different flow characteristics when introduced to water. I would really have a hard time lumping these two colors together as one and the same, because I see them having very different uses, undertones, and subjects that they would work best for. Artemis being very dark, cool, and atmospheric, perfect for cityscapes, moody skies, dark clouds, and nighttime skyscapes. Then there's Moonglow, being this very warm, almost like a celestial nebulous of untamed skies. It has a profound and stormy feel. I would find it nearly impossible to say that one could easily replace the other. I hope you found this comparison helpful, and it cleared up some of the questions that you have about these two colors. If you like this comparison, I would love it if you would let me know by liking this video, leaving a comment down below, and sharing this video with anyone who may find it helpful. If you find value in my content, I would love it if you would consider subscribing to my channel, and even consider supporting me on Patreon. Of course, just you being here and watching my videos is an amazing amount of support that never goes unnoticed. I hope you are all having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!